Okay, now we move to our last session of the event today. We have Jason Bailey, who is the co-founder and CEO of ClubNFT. Jason is an art nerd looking to build a new art world through the fusion of art and technology. Let's move to the Can Machine Learning Predict the Price of Art at Auction stage? To your left, watch this wonderful talk. I'm really excited for it. Jason, go ahead.
Hi there. Hope everyone's having a great day. So I'd first like to start by thanking MIT Technology Review Arabia for having me as a speaker today. My name's Jason Bailey, and I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite topics / questions, which is, can machine learning predict the price of art? So quick outline, I usually like to start by introducing myself and my background a little bit. I think it helps people to know sort of where I come from, to understand sort of how I approach this problem. We'll talk a little bit about some of my approaches at predicting the price of art at auction, some research that I did for a paper for the Harvard Data Science Review, the key points that fell out of that research, and then where to next. So I usually start by sharing with folks that I grew up in a family of engineers. My dad was an engineer, my older brother was an engineer, my younger brother was an engineer, but all I ever wanted to be was an artist. The same way some kids grow up and want to be rock stars or musicians. I just wanted to be an artist, and I was actually not great at math and science and engineering, but all of that influence from my family sort of rubbed off for me. But I spent a lot of my time making art and studying art history growing up. But when it came time to go to school, I went to Framingham State for my undergraduate, studied painting, sculpture, art history, printmaking, things like that. And later on, went back to school nights and got my MFA at Mass Art in a program that was much more focused around sort of digital art and user interface and data visualization. But all that time, I had been working in tech companies. So I learned pretty early on that there weren't a lot of opportunities for people with art degrees in the United States. So I kind of went into the family business and worked mostly in software engineering companies, including 10 years at two companies that were started by Michael Stonebreaker and Andy Palmer. So some folks may know Dr. Stonebreaker actually won the Turing Award a few years back, which is sort of like the equivalent to the Nobel Peace Prize, but for computing. So considered myself very lucky to work with Dr. Stonebreaker. Vertica was an analytic database company still around. And then Tamer was a machine learning company that helped companies sort of bring together large data sets. And on my commute into those jobs, I read this book called Provenance about art forgery. And as someone who loves art history, my mind was sort of blown at the number of works that are considered to be forged, and not only the works, but the actual provenance themselves. So something like 15 to 20% is the estimate. So I thought, with my background in data and analytics, how is this possible? Art's such an important thing to us. We have all these, temperature controlled, guarded museums and all these institutions where you can study art. How is it that we could have this forgery problem? Where is the database? So I reached out to all these major academic universities and institutions with this same question: where is the database that lists out all the complete works by these best known artists? And they all kind of came back and said the same thing, which is, sadly, no such database exists. We're not sure if it ever will, which blew my mind because, it's like a $65 billion art market. So I took it upon myself to try to at least show that we could make a dent in the problem. So about 5 years ago, I built this scanner with my brother and started collecting these rare art books called catalogs raisonnés that are considered the authoritative source for the complete works for given artists, and scanned all these books and created the world's largest database of complete works by 20th century artists, just nights and weekends as sort of my hobby. And then once I had that data, I got really curious about what are some things that I could do with that data that might be interesting. So I partnered up with data scientist Kyle Waters, and in 2018, he had done a bunch of research on how to use machine learning around prediction, and we kind of fed my data and blended it in with some auction data. We used a model called random forest, and I'm not the data scientist of the two. Again, my background was more in art, although I've worked in tech for the better part of 20 years. Kyle explained to me that this model is particularly good for smaller data sets. And we have sort of a data set size problem in the art world in general. So yeah, we'll get into that a little bit, but that was partially why I'd worked on that project to gather all that data. So we put out public estimates for this particular auction for 4 works. And I know people might think, well, 4 works, it's sort of a laughably small sample size. But we did put out the public estimates before the auction happened. 1 for Georgia O'Keeffe, 1 for Edward Hopper, 1 for the John Marin painting, and 1 for Arthur Dove. And here you can see sort of Christie's estimates, our estimates, and sort of the error. So we actually outperformed Christie's estimates through our estimates. Again, tiny sample size, and it was particularly around this Marin painting. But I had presented these results in a few different presentations, and someone from the Harvard Data Science Review actually thought it was pretty interesting and gave me the opportunity. They commissioned me to do some research to write an article about, can you actually predict art prices at a larger scale using machine learning? So it's an interesting problem. Before we even get into the research, if you think about the artworks that everybody sort of heard about in these massive sales in the last several years, you have Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, which is, people are skeptical whether or not it's actually by Leonardo, and it was heavily restored. It came out and sold for $450 million, setting the record for most money spent on an artwork ever. Shortly after that, we see what was essentially a plastic bunny rabbit remade in steel by Jeff Koons break the record for most expensive artwork sold by a living artist at $91 million. And things really get sort of unpredictable and weird, right? So there's this Banksy that sort of made the news because it shredded itself during auction. And we've got this sort of long-standing belief that the condition of an artwork matters. So a lot of people assumed, well, this is worthless now. But interestingly, someone paid $1.4 million for it. And then, of course, Maurizio Catalan's Banana, which was shown at Art Basel, Miami in 2019. So this is a banana that an artist duct taped to the wall and sold for $120,000. So interestingly, to sort of follow up on the Banksy, very recently, that same Banksy that people thought, well, this will never sell because it was shredded. Not only did it sell for $1.4 million in 2018, it then sold for $25 million just a month or two ago. So when there's sort of these crazy world of ridiculous prices where a banana can sell for $120,000, and a painting shreds itself and the condition goes down and it goes up in value, it can feel like a really unpredictable space, right? And when I went into the research, actually most of the papers that I read kind of came to that conclusion, right? That essentially, this is such a wild space that's so fickle and tied to taste that they doubt that there's actually any way to predict the art market. But we still have art experts at every auction house who are under pressure to be able to sort of make assessments on what an artwork could be worth, right? So we call these people appraisers, right? And there are humans that look at these works. They hate when I call what they do prediction, because they don't see it as prediction. They see prediction as like trying to figure out if a work will go up in value in 5-10 years or down in value. But to me, there is an element of prediction and appraisal, because you're trying to choose a range where this work will sell for in a few days, weeks, or months. Interestingly, we know from studies that that human appraisers, it's not just entirely random, it's a skill, right? So there are studies that have shown how often the appraisals by the appraisers sort of the final prices land within their range. And there's also evidence from studies that show not only is human appraisal a skill, but that if you're an auction house or an appraiser and you've done multiple appraisals for the same artist, your skill actually goes up, as does the likelihood of completing the sale. So one thought around why that might be the case is because if you're an auction house known for selling a certain artist, say Cy Twombly, there's a limited number of collectors who can afford and might have interest in that artist, and you might get a reputation for sort of having expertise and getting to know those particular collectors, which could give you an advantage that would increase your accuracy. But it still left me thinking, is appraisal an art form, sort of like these soft skills where it's like a human and it's based on relationships and who they know? Or is it potentially something that can be automated? In order to automate it, there would need to be sort of a set of steps that could be reproducible and describable and breakdownable. So that's when I started looking at AI and ML and how they were being sort of applied to try to do price prediction for artworks. And one of the most interesting things that I learned right off the bat is you would assume that with art, because it's something that we go and we look at it, that's essentially, what art is for. It's something that we think of as being visual and that we look at, that things like convolutional neural networks, which are these machine learning algorithms that are specifically designed around visual properties, would perform pretty well. But what was surprising is that it's actually metadata, so sort of text about the artist or the year that the work was created. These kind of things were much more important in terms of being able to predict price than anything that had to do with the visual, which was hard for me to, as an artist, it was hard for me to wrap my head around. Shouldn't the value of an artwork be in how the artwork looks, because that's how we appreciate these things. But then when I thought about it more, I was like, well, I guess that should have been obvious, right? Because we know when we see artworks that turn out to be forgeries, they lose their value and become almost worthless right away. So this is a Rothko that was purchased by, I think his name was Domenico De Sale in 2004 for $8.3 million. Should probably say million and not 8.3. And when it was discovered later that it was a forgery, it was worth essentially nothing. Now, why that fascinates me is because nothing changed about the canvas, right? So the actual pigment, the paint, the composition, the canvas was exactly the same as it was the day before. But once it's no longer attributed to the artist, its value drops to almost nothing, which reassures us on this idea that, okay, it's actually not what an artwork looks like that the price is based on. It's really sort of legacy of the artist. So when we start thinking that way, we can think about other ways that machine learning or AI might become more interesting in figuring out what a painting is worth that are not quite price prediction, but there's a company called Art Recognition out of Switzerland. So it's Dr. Karina Popovici and Christian Hope Ohl. And they've sort of got this brilliant model where they take all the known artworks by an artist and they scan them all in, and then they break them up into smaller pieces and scan them again, because again, you need a larger data set in order to have a decent set of training data for the machine learning model. And they've had pretty good success actually for the better known artists in being able to use machine learning to identify when something is a forgery. Now, that may sound like a different problem than price prediction, but if we think again that when the work is not by the artist we think it's by, its value can drop from $8 million to zero. Figuring out and authenticating using machine learning may actually be one of the more important uses of machine learning. So a lot of times when I talk about this, people come and they push back on me and say, well, maybe reputation is built on the quality of art. Maybe it's just a heuristic. They're one and the same, Jason. The people get the reputation because of the quality of their art. But there's this really interesting paper by Freiberger that looks at what makes artists successful. And it turns out that it has a lot to do with how close they were born to high prestige institutions. So they look at all these artists and they break them into two different groups. Those that were sort of born near these, dozen or fewer super influential, cultural institutions, and those that weren't. And what they learned is that those that are sort of born into these prestigious, locations have twice as many exhibitions, 4.7 the times sales, and 5.2 times their max price, selling price. So, and sadly, the paper goes on to say that it's very rare if you're born outside of the bubble of these prestigious institutions to become, an artist who benefits and becomes prestigious. So what that tells me is that there are hyper talented artists who maybe don't have reputation because they don't have access to the prestigious institutions. So I do not see sort of prestige or reputation as being sort of just a placeholder for skill or talent. So as part of this paper that I wrote, I was curious to see, is anyone actually using machine learning at scale? So I read a bunch of academic papers, but then went and talked to the machine learning team at Sotheby's. So Sotheby's acquired a group called Thread Genius, and Thread Genius basically came back and validated a lot of what my thoughts were around reputation being important. In fact, Andrew Shum said essentially in examining the features that drive up the price of artworks at auction, the number of bidders was second only to the artist who created the work. So again, we see the artist who creates the work become important. But what's neat here that didn't surface in my other research is that Sotheby's is in sort of a unique position where they have data that academic institutions wouldn't have for their research. Sotheby's has data on collectors. And what's interesting about this quote or this part of the interview is that they're essentially saying it's actually not that much to do with how the painting looks, and it's not that much to do with, well, it's somewhat to do with the artist and their reputation. But really the thing that drives the price up is how many bidders are there, right? Because that drives the competition. So one of the interesting things that they got into in the interview is that right now they're bottlenecked a little bit. They have, tens of thousands of works that they want to appraise, but they all have to be appraised by a human. And while the higher end works will always be appraised by humans, if they can get appraisal, even if it's less accurate, and all the studies that I looked at showed that appraisal, machine learning driven appraisal is less accurate than human appraisal. If they can use it, even if it's less accurate, to do more frequent appraisals across a larger number of works, instead of just appraising works that go to auction, appraise everything. Appraise every work that Sotheby's ever sold. And if you see a discrepancy between, what the collector bought it for 3 or 4 or 5 years ago and what it could sell for now, you could almost create an artificial bidding war because all the people that collect what they want to collect, and you can sort of incite people to free up work based on the ability to predict roughly how much it would sell for. So they have some really interesting, ideas around how to automate sort of end-to-end the less expensive works that maybe wouldn't be as exciting or interesting or require as a detailed appraisal that a human could give, and leave the higher-end works for the humans. That also, if you think about these sort of real estate websites where they appraise every single house, not just the ones that are for sale, there's a lot of studies that show that price transparency actually increases liquidity. So another thing that could happen if you have these machine learning models that are appraising every artwork, every few weeks, instead of just the ones that are going for sale, we think there's actually research showing that there could be an increase in liquidity in the market as well. So summary of sort of the findings. Many people believe that art prices are unpredictable, yet there are practical needs to do so. We've got sort of people that have to make predictions around what artworks will sell for via appraisal. Humans are currently more accurate than machine learning based on the research that I had done a year or so ago. That may change, but at the moment, humans tend to be more accurate. Machine learning can potentially scale to appraise all art. So while machine learning isn't as accurate, it can kick butt against a human in terms of how many appraisals it can do. It can go all day and night and really fast, and doesn't have the overhead of hiring individual appraisers. Automated pricing could increase liquidity. So we talked a little bit about that, how when people don't know if something's for sale or what the price is, and the art world's sort of notorious for price opacity, they're more hesitant to buy. But there are a lot of studies that show increases in price opacity would lead to more liquidity. And then we see end-to-end fully automated sales in the near future, or we may see automated end-to-end sales for those reasons in the near future. And then the last thing that I like to throw in, I come from an art appreciation background. I love art. I studied art. I make art. And often when I talk about sort of prediction and price prediction, people give me a hard time, and they're like, "Well, isn't this just treating art like a commodity? And aren't you just, by trying to make these predictions and overlay math aren't you destroying what's great about art? And I would say the caveat there is that art's value and art's price are two very different things. Art's price is what anybody with enough money will spend to buy an artwork. Art's value is what gets us to line up around the block to go into a museum to see works that are like beautiful and change our lives, right? And we don't buy those works and come home with them. It's just sort of this authentic appreciation of art that's separate from what someone is willing to pay for it. So with that, I would say thanks, and I think we've got some time for Q&A. I think I'm gonna stop sharing here and swap over.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
This is really cool. What you do is really cool. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. First one is, art has many formats and it's different things to different people. This shows in some of the examples you showed just now. How will this help make progress in teaching AI to price art given the inconsistency of data it's being fed?
Yeah, I think art does mean different things to different people. And part of what I learned, those examples that I threw out in the beginning, the banana and like the absurd things, the self-shredding Banksy, those are very hard to predict because they're outliers by definition, right? The reason they're in the news is because they blow our minds and they're outliers. But what we have to remember, if we look at the art market, most works that sell actually have a lot of other similar works that you could train a model on, right? So if you're, I don't know, art objects, like if you're going to buy like a mid-century modern chair or whatever, there's a high volume of sales of other chairs that you can actually go in, whereas there's not a high number of banana sales that we can compare to, right? So I don't think at the highest levels of the market where these works are like, blowing people's minds with the sale prices, I don't know that we'll ever get good at predicting those values. But the further we go down to things like multiples or prints where we see lots of past history and sales and have more data, we can get, I'm more optimistic that we can get the data required to train models and do a pretty good job.
Great. Another question is, which approach do you think would give the most accurate prediction? Is it linear regression on metadata, or is it CNNs on the artwork? Or is it a combination of both?
I think it'll be a combination of both. And I think for a while, again, I'm not a machine learning scientist, but we did look at both CNNs and linear regressions. And I would say that the smartest folks I know in the AI ML space are still saying that we're at a stage where it's sort of augmentation, right? It's not the machine replacing the human. It's humans plus machine, right? That sort of gets us the highest accuracy. So I would say it's I think they call it, I don't want to use words I don't fully understand, but ensemble approach, right? Where we combine together different approaches and then sort of augment them with humans to get to the higher accuracy.
Third question is, how do you see this as part of the future curriculum for art majors?
Oh, it's interesting. I don't know. So, I mean, I don't necessarily, that would be sort of a dystopian universe for me. I'm not so sure that I want artists trying to optimize what they make for sale. To me, the beauty and amazing thing about art is that people can sort of think so freely and be so creative, unbound from the need to have to sell the work. Now, the other side of that is artists need to make a living. So I wouldn't be surprised if, some actionable data comes out around what is more likely to sell if some artists choose to incorporate that into their process, but I kind of hope they don't.
Yeah. Okay, we have, I think, time for one more question. What are other possible ways AI could contribute to art in a way that does not even seem to be possible today? Wow.
Yeah, so a lot of my research and writing is actually around how artists are using AI. And so today we talked about AI and ML for prediction, but what I'm better known for maybe is writing about generative art and how artists are using AI, things like GANs, generative adversarial networks, to train models on large groups of images and trying to make the model output images that look so convincing that it'd be hard to tell them apart from what was going into that model. So there are artists like Mario Klingemann, Helena Sarin, Robbie Barrett, who are doing really fascinating and interesting work using generative adversarial networks, or GANs. You can look up GAN art, and there's some really, really cool work being done there.
That's very cool. Okay, I think we end with this question. Thank you so much, Jason. You're the last session for today, and we had like the best ending with you.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I love to nerd out about this stuff, and it was really kind of you to let me join.
Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
Take care.